picture the interior of an AT-6 aircraft.
Yeah.
It's a single-engine advanced trainer plane left over from the Second World War.
Right. Loud, completely unpressurized, and definitely not designed for high-altitude mountainous transport.
Exactly. Now, I want you to imagine you are sitting in the cockpit of this aging plane in the early 1960s, and you're staring at a jagged wall of solid rock. You're looking at the Andes Mountains.
And those peaks rise up to, what, 20,000 feet?
Yeah, which is significantly higher than the absolute service ceiling of a fully loaded AT-6. You physically cannot fly over them.
Because if you pull up, the thin air just robs the wings of lift, right?
Right, the engine will stall and you're going to drop right out of the sky. So your absolute only option is to fly under them.
Which means navigating this labyrinth of narrow, incredibly treacherous mountain passes.
Yeah. The pilot is threading this aircraft through these deep stone valleys, relying on nothing more sophisticated than a mechanical stopwatch and a magnetic compass to keep track of where they are.
It's terrifying. I mean, if a wall of clouds suddenly rolls into the pass ahead of them.
Or if the winds shifting off the glaciers create a sudden downdraft, there is virtually zero margin for error. You're just gone.
Wow. And the man sitting in that plane paying the pilot to take this massive risk, he isn't a military scout, is he?
No, not at all. He isn't an extreme explorer. He's a newly commissioned epidemiology officer with the United States Public Health Service, a doctor named Ronald MacKenzie.
Right.
He's actually chartered 2 of these surplus planes, one for himself, one for his rudimentary gear, and he is flying completely blind, off mission, and entirely unauthorized.
Heading straight toward the remote Beni lowlands of Bolivia.
Exactly. He's doing all of this because he just heard a rumor from an embassy staffer about this invisible killer, a pathogen that the terrified local villagers are calling black typhus.
And we should clarify, it's a disease that doesn't just kill, it practically destroys the human body from the inside out.
It's awful. What did the initial reports look like?
Well, they described victims suddenly developing severe fevers and agonizing muscle aches. But then the truly horrifying phase began a few days later when the vascular system essentially just began to break down.
So they start bleeding.
Right. The victims would start hemorrhaging from their mucous membranes. They would bleed from the nose, bleed from the gums, and just suffer massive, catastrophic internal bleeding in the gut.
Oh, man.
Entire households in these remote, thatch-roofed villages were just being erased. Between 1959 and 1962, this completely unidentified illness infected roughly 470 people.
And killed how many?
142 of them.
Wow, that is a 30% fatality rate. Basically, 1 in 3 people who caught it died. I want you, listening to this deep dive, to really hold that number in your mind.
It's a staggering figure.
It is. Because our mission today is to take a measured, highly factual exploration of what happens when human beings actively choose to walk into a plague zone with those kinds of odds.
Yeah, this is a profound, deeply serious chapter in the rise and fall of the U.S. Public Health Service.
Right, this isn't just a story about a virus. It's the story of an overseas scientific citadel, the men and women who manned it, the handsaws and homemade glass boxes they used to fight the unknown.
And the immense, permanent price they paid in their own health to stop a slaughter.
To truly understand how Dr. MacKenzie ended up in that AT-6 aircraft, and how the American scientific apparatus responded to this crisis, we have to look at the global posture of the United States Public Health Service back then.
Right, mid-20th century. This was an era defined by a very specific concept of biological defense.
The strategy wasn't just to wait at the borders of the United States for a disease to arrive, was it?
Not at all. The strategy was forward deployment. And the crown jewel of that strategy in the Western Hemisphere was MARU.
MARU, which stands for the Middle America Research Unit.
Exactly. MARU was situated in the Panama Canal Zone. It was this joint operation between the Public Health Service and the National Institutes of Health.
And it was heavily backed by the logistical and military muscle of the Defense Department.
Right. When we think of a citadel, we usually picture massive stone walls designed to keep an invading army out. But MARU was a fortress built to house the people who were running toward the fight.
It's like an early warning radar station for global biology. The location in the Canal Zone was intensely deliberate, right?
Absolutely. The Canal Zone provided a secure, heavily resourced military footprint right on the edge of the tropics.
Because if you're trying to combat emerging tropical diseases, you really can't do that effectively from a sterile laboratory in Bethesda, Maryland, or Atlanta, Georgia.
No, you can't. The cold chain, meaning the logistical network required to keep biological specimens viable, was incredibly fragile in the 1960s.
Right, no overnight shipping on dry ice from the jungle.
Exactly. If an anomaly appeared in the Amazon basin and you had to wait weeks to get visas, organize transport, and ship deteriorating tissue samples back to the continental United States, the epidemic would just outpace you.
The pathogen would win, because by the time the frozen tissue thaws out on a runway in Miami, the RNA might be completely degraded. You need the infrastructure right there in the jungle's backyard.
Which is exactly what MARU provided. It was hardened physical infrastructure. Centrifuges, deep freezers, sterile surgical equipment, secure animal containment facilities.
All located just a few hours' flight from the deepest jungles of Central and South America.
Yeah, it allowed for rapid, high-level scientific deployment. It truly was the zenith of American public health global reach.
And the officers stationed there, they were acclimatized to the environment, right? They spoke the languages, they understood the local ecology.
Right, and they were ready to jump at a moment's notice. It really was a global network, like a tripwire stretching across the planet.
If you look at the sheer scale of how the Public Health Service operated at this time, it's staggering. Look at a guy like Dr. Jacob Brody.
Oh yeah, Brody is a great example.
He was an elite Public Health Service epidemiologist who had previously rotated through the MARU outpost in Panama. But during the exact same time frame that this terrifying bleeding fever was erupting in the Bolivian lowlands, he wasn't in the tropics.
Right, he'd been deployed to the opposite extreme of the Earth.
Exactly. He was up in the Arctic Circle investigating devastating measles outbreaks among Alaska natives.
It just perfectly illustrates the vast, rotating, globe-trotting nature of the Public Health Service Officer Corps in that era.
They were this specialized cadre of medical detectives, dropped into the freezing tundra of Alaska one month and the sweltering malarial jungles of the equator the next.
And they operated with a supreme level of institutional confidence. They truly believed that with the scientific method, rigorous epidemiology, and just enough shoe leather, any biological threat could be identified and neutralized.
But that institutional confidence was about to hit a brick wall in the Beni lowlands. Which brings us back to Dr. Ronald MacKenzie and his rogue flight.
Right.
I want to trace the exact sequence of events that put him in that plane, because it perfectly captures the friction between bureaucratic planning and the chaotic realities of a crisis.
So MacKenzie arrives at his new posting in Panama on August 1st, 1961.
He is a subspecialized epidemiology officer, and his boss is Dr. Henry Beye, a senior, highly respected NIH figure who directed the MARU operations.
And Dr. Beye recognized that he had a sharp, eager new recruit who just needed some field experience.
According to primary family accounts, specifically the very detailed oral history provided later by Dr. MacKenzie's son Beye, assigned MacKenzie to a pretty routine, highly structured mission.
Right, the U.S. military was sending a nutritional survey team down to Bolivia.
The objective was essentially bureaucratic: measure caloric intake, assess the baseline health of various populations, file the paperwork, and return.
Beye attached MacKenzie to this team basically just to get his boots dirty in a South American deployment.
I can only imagine how a guy trained to hunt down lethal pathogens felt about weighing rations for a nutritional survey.
Yeah, probably not thrilled.
So MacKenzie is down in La Paz, the capital of Bolivia, traveling with this military unit. And this completely chance encounter changes the course of medical history.
What happened?
A U.S. Embassy staffer is going over the flight manifest for the military team, and he notices MacKenzie's name. It wasn't on the original clearance list.
Right.
So the staffer pulls him aside and essentially asks, "Who are you and why are you attached to this unit?"
And MacKenzie's response is incredibly telling. He doesn't give the official, bureaucratic answer.
Right. He tells the staffer, "I'm looking for diseases."
He openly admits that the nutritional survey is just a vehicle to get him into the field.
"I'm looking for diseases."
Yeah.
It's such a blunt, almost primal statement of purpose.
Yeah.
And that embassy staffer, rather than reporting him for being off mission, essentially points him toward the fire.
Right. The staffer tells him that if he's looking for diseases, there are these horrifying reports filtering out of the Beni department.
They're calling it black typhus, and the local medical infrastructure is completely overwhelmed.
And we have to keep the geography in mind here. The Badani is a vast, deeply isolated region of tropical savanna and rainforest in northeastern Bolivia.
In the early 1960s, there were virtually no paved roads connecting it to the outside world, right?
Basically none. During the rainy season, large swaths of the region simply vanish underwater, turning into these massive floodplains.
So the only practical way in or out was by air or by river.
Exactly. The people living there, farmers, ranchers, indigenous communities, they were geographically trapped with this virus.
And the local doctors, they were doing everything humanly possible. But when you were facing a completely novel hemorrhagic fever, standard medical interventions like antibiotics do absolutely nothing.
It was a localized apocalypse.
So MacKenzie hears this, and he makes a decision that frankly seems borderline insane from a modern administrative perspective.
He abandons the military nutritional survey.
Yeah. He doesn't route a request up the chain of command to Dr. Beye in Panama. He doesn't wait for the CDC or the NIH to convene an exploratory committee.
He just walks away from his assigned unit.
He goes to the airfield, charters those 2 surplus U.S. Army AT-6 aircraft, and tells the pilots to fly him to San Joaquín, the epicenter of the slaughter.
We really have to analyze the psychology of that decision. Was it a reckless breach of protocol by a junior officer? Yes, undeniably.
But it also reveals the deeply ingrained culture of the disease detectives of that era.
Right, they prioritized the hunt over the itinerary. MacKenzie understood that if a pathogen is killing 30% of the people it touches, time is the single most critical variable.
You cannot manage a fast-moving lethal outbreak from a desk thousands of miles away. You have to close the distance immediately.
Exactly.
I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of his commanding officer, Dr. Beye, when he finally gets the telegram that his new recruit has just vanished into the jungle.
Oh, I'm sure it was chaotic back in Panama.
It's like a storm chaser who's supposed to be launching weather balloons, but he sees a massive, uncharted F5 tornado on the horizon, drops his clipboard, and just drives his truck straight into the vortex.
That's exactly what it was. But the sheer terror of that AT-6 flight under the Andes really emphasizes something important.
Awesome.
That before these scientists ever faced the microscopic threat of the virus, they were constantly fighting the macro threats of geography and gravity.
The logistical realities of operating in this environment were lethal in their own right. And MacKenzie's intuition about the disease proved to be entirely correct once he got there.
Right. The moment he survived that flight, landed on the dirt strip in San Joaquin, and began physically examining the actively bleeding patients, his epidemiological training kicked in.
He recognized the symptoms. He knew definitively that this was not typhus.
Because typhus is caused by bacteria transmitted by lice or fleas, and it presents differently.
Yeah, this was a classic, albeit completely unidentified hemorrhagic fever.
But recognizing that a disease is novel doesn't help you cure it.
No. To actually fight this thing, to figure out how it's transmitting and how to stop it, they needed physical proof. They needed a specimen.
And this is where the reality of 1960s field virology becomes incredibly grim, because the virus is hiding deep within the organs of the victims.
And in a remote jungle village with no electricity, no refrigeration, and definitely no sterile surgical theater, acquiring that tissue means performing a field autopsy.
On someone who has just died from one of the most infectious lethal agents on the planet?
The absolute necessity of the physical specimen cannot be overstated here. Today, we might take a simple nasal swab, extract the viral RNA, sequence the genome using a portable field device, and email the genetic code back to a lab in hours.
But in 1961, virology was profoundly physical. You had to carve the live infected tissue out of the deceased patient.
Plunge it into whatever cooling mechanism you had, usually liquid nitrogen or dry ice if you could even get it, and physically transport that tissue back to a Citadel laboratory like MARU.
And relying again on the profoundly vivid first-person account of Dr. MacKenzie's son, who later recorded his father's history, we learn exactly how this was accomplished in San Joaquin.
Right. MacKenzie, working alongside a really courageous local Bolivian physician, had to extract a brain specimen from a villager who had succumbed to the fever.
And they didn't have a modern oscillating striker saw that cleanly cuts through bone without damaging tissue.
No. They didn't have positive pressure biohazard suits. They used a simple carpenter's handsaw to carefully cut open the skull of this victim.
Just think about the mechanics of that. The physical exertion required to saw through a human skull in the sweltering, stagnant heat of the tropics.
Every drop of sweat, every microscopic splinter of bone, every drop of blood or cerebrospinal fluid represents a potential exposure event.
They are inches away from a pathogen that just destroyed the body on the table.
And yet, amidst this terrifying crude procedure, they demonstrated a profound level of humanity and cultural sensitivity.
Because the local burial customs in the body department demanded that a body be buried whole and intact for spiritual reasons.
Right. So MacKenzie and the local doctor couldn't just remove the brain and leave an empty cranial cavity.
No, after they secured the lethal specimen, they actually went outside, searched the ground, and found a rock of roughly similar weight and displacement to the human brain.
They carefully placed that rock inside the skull, replaced the bone cap, and meticulously sewed the scalp closed.
They honored the dignity of the victim and the deeply held beliefs of the community, even while executing high-level virology.
It is a striking juxtaposition. The crude reality of a handsaw paired with such deep, respectful humanity.
It shows that they understood that public health is not just about the science, it is fundamentally about trust.
Exactly. If you violate the cultural norms of a traumatized community, they will hide the sick from you, and you will never break the epidemic.
So they have the brain tissue, they have a spleen specimen, now they have to get it back to MARU.
And the macro threats of geography strike again. There is a deeply illustrative story about how perilous this logistical chain was.
Yeah, later in the crisis, the United States Air Force was ferrying more MARU personnel into the Beye.
Including the brilliant virologist Dr. Patricia Webb.
Right. They were on a military transport plane, a C-47, which is the military version of the DC-3, flying in to join the fight.
They are flying over the dense Amazonian canopy, searching for the remote dirt airstrip at San Joaquín. But due to a severe navigational or fueling miscalculation, the aircraft actually ran out of fuel while they were circling the jungle.
It is pure, unadulterated terror. You are a scientist flying in to fight a microscopic killer, and suddenly the engine starts sputtering and coughing.
The aircrew literally tells the scientists in the back of the plane to strap on heavy military parachutes.
They are preparing to open the door and jump blind into a triple canopy rainforest.
If the fall doesn't kill you, the sheer isolation of the jungle likely will.
But miraculously, right as the engines died completely and the propeller stopped spinning, the pilot spotted the dirt strip.
And essentially glided the dead, silent aircraft down to a rough landing.
It forces us to recognize the sheer operational friction of this era. They were fighting the jungle, fighting the weather, and fighting failing machinery just to get the science to the starting line.
But once they finally secured the specimens and survived the journey back to Panama, the venue of the danger radically shifted.
Right. It moved from the wild, unpredictable jungle of the Beye to the sterile, yet profoundly hazardous confines of the MARU laboratory.
Now the specimen is in the citadel. The scientists have to isolate whatever is inside it.
And on May 18, 1963, a MARU virologist named Dr. Karl Johnson achieved a massive breakthrough.
He successfully isolated the virus from the spleen tissue of a deceased patient.
They officially named it Machupo after the local river that flows near the town of San Joaquín.
But we have to stop and explain what the word isolation actually means in this context, because it sounds so clean, so procedural.
It really does. To isolate a virus means to separate it from all the other cellular material, bacteria, and debris in the tissue sample.
You're growing a pure culture of the virus itself.
Exactly. In a modern setting, you do this inside a biosafety level 4 or BSL-4 laboratory.
You're wearing a fully encapsulated, pressurized suit with a dedicated breathing air supply.
You are working inside negative pressure cabinets with heavy HEPA filtration. If your suit gets punctured, the positive pressure blows air out, preventing the pathogen from getting in.
But Dr. Karl Johnson was operating in 1963. None of that technology existed.
None of it.
So how do you physically manipulate a virus that kills 1 in 3 people without killing yourself in the process?
You improvise. Johnson constructed a homemade containment unit.
He built a coffin-sized box out of glass.
He had to meticulously seal every edge and seam, likely using whatever industrial sealants or epoxies he could find in the canal zone, just to ensure the air inside the box could not leak out into the room.
Then, he fitted the glass with thick, heavy rubber gloves that allowed him to reach inside.
I'm picturing this, and it's terrifying. It's like an early, rudimentary, deep-sea diving bell.
Yes. You are lowering yourself into an environment of crushing pressure that wants to kill you instantly, and your only defense is this incredibly fragile, improvised barrier.
He is sitting in a humid room in Panama. His hands are sweating inside these thick rubber gloves, and he is manipulating aerosolized Machupo virus.
He knows for an absolute fact that if there is a single microscopic tear in that rubber, or if a seal on the glass fails, he will inhale the virus and likely die an agonizing death.
The margin for human error is literally zero.
It requires a level of psychological compartmentalization that is almost unfathomable.
He had to subordinate his primal fear of death to his absolute dedication to the scientific method. It was a crude, desperate ancestor to modern BSL-4 containment.
And while Johnson was performing this incredibly hazardous isolation, his colleague and life partner, Dr. Patricia Webb, played a crucial role in classifying exactly what this monster was.
Right. She analyzed the Machupo virus and officially classified it as an arenavirus.
And her specific expertise in handling and classifying this highly lethal agent in Panama directly paved the way for how the scientific community would later approach other terrifying emerging viruses.
Like Lassa fever and Ebola in the decades to come. She really developed the foundational protocols for how to respect and manage these specific types of pathogens.
Now, regarding the historical record of this isolation, there is a nuance we must address carefully.
Yeah, the documented sources contain a slight discrepancy.
If you look at the contemporaneous press, specifically the New York Times reporting in July of 1963, the articles publicly credited Dr. MacKenzie with isolating the virus.
However, the peer-reviewed scientific papers published later, in 1965, formally named Dr. Karl Johnson as the scientist who achieved the definitive laboratory isolation.
Which totally makes sense when you break down the mechanics of the operation. The press was likely conflating the field retrieval with the lab isolation.
Exactly. MacKenzie was the vanguard. He led the dangerous field investigation, he mapped the human pattern of the infection, and he was the one who actually sawed open the skull and obtained the crucial original specimen.
He brought the fire back from the mountain.
Precisely. But Dr. Karl Johnson was the virologist who took that fire, placed it inside his homemade glass box, and performed the highly technical, incredibly perilous laboratory procedures to definitively separate and identify the Machupo virus.
Both roles were absolutely vital. It was a complex, collaborative effort between field epidemiology and laboratory virology.
But while the scientists in the safety of the Canal Zone wrestled with the virus inside a glass box, we cannot forget that the epidemic in Bolivia was still raging.
Right. It was still slaughtering villagers. During the peak of the epidemic in 1963 and 1964, the situation in San Joaquín was catastrophic.
We are talking about over 600 documented cases in a town that only had a few thousand residents in total.
The virus was tearing through families. And the most terrifying part, even after they isolated it, there was no cure.
None whatsoever. Antibiotics only kill bacteria. They're entirely useless against a virus.
And developing a vaccine takes years, if not decades.
So the only medical intervention available was preventive measures to try and halt the spread, and intensely grueling, hands-on supportive care for those who were already infected.
Let's talk about the mechanics of that supportive care, because it was brutal.
A hemorrhagic fever attacks the vascular system, meaning your blood vessels start leaking fluid.
The patients suffer massive drops in blood pressure, leading to shock.
So the care requires constantly administering intravenous fluids to keep the blood volume up, maintaining basic nutrition when the patient is too weak to eat,
and providing round-the-clock nursing to keep their bodies strong enough to hopefully fight off the virus on their own.
And this incredible burden of care did not fall solely on the scientists from MARU.
No. It fell to an improvised, non-public health service coalition that was operating under the most primitive, exhausting conditions imaginable.
Two absolutely pivotal figures emerged in this phase of the story. Captain Dr. James Warren Ryan and a nurse named Rose Navarro.
Captain Ryan was a United States Army Special Forces Group surgeon and a fully qualified paratrooper.
When the call for help went out, he literally parachuted into the roadless, inaccessible Beye territory, dragging medical supplies with him to set up tactical field clinics.
And working right alongside him was Rose Navarro, a deeply dedicated nurse serving with the United States Peace Corps.
We really must emphasize the extraordinary personal risk they were taking every single minute of the day.
They were providing intimate bedside care to patients who were actively bleeding from their mucous membranes.
These patients were shedding massive amounts of the highly infectious Machupo virus in their blood, their saliva, their vomit, and their urine.
And Ryan and Navarro were doing this long before the invention of modern personal protective equipment.
There were no Tyvek suits. There were no N95 respirators or face shields.
They were wearing standard basic medical scrubs, relying on rigorous hand washing and sheer luck to protect themselves.
It highlights this unspoken yet profound logic in the missions division of labor.
The public health service scientists from MARU Johnson, Webb, MacKenzie, Beye, they had to focus strictly on the epidemiology, the virology, and the ecology.
Their job was to figure out the machinery of the virus so they could break it and save thousands of future lives.
But until they succeeded in that mission, the Special Forces medics like Captain Ryan and Peace Corps nurses like Rose Navarro had to sit in the mud and the heat with the actively dying.
They had to hold the line. It was a seamless, desperate web of collaborative bravery.
The military, the Peace Corps, and the Public Health Service all working together, knowing full well that the disease could kill the very people tending to the sick.
They survived by maintaining absolute, uncompromising discipline in their hygiene and their protocols, even when they were exhausted to the point of collapse.
But keeping one patient alive at the bedside doesn't stop the next villager from getting infected.
The bedside care was a holding action.
To truly end the nightmare, the scientists had to stop looking at human blood and start looking at the ecology of the jungle itself.
They had to answer the most critical question. How is the virus getting into the houses in the first place?
Which brings us to the ecological puzzle. Because the root cause of this entire terrifying epidemic wasn't some ancient curse awakening in the jungle.
No, it was a completely man-made ecological accident that had been slowly building since the 1950s. This is a masterclass in the lethal nature of unintended consequences.
Let's trace the dominoes. Following the 1952 Bolivian Revolution, agricultural policies shifted.
Right, and settlers began heavily clearing the natural jungle in the Beye region to plant massive fields of maize.
Now, by cutting down the diverse, balanced rainforest ecosystem and replacing it with massive, concentrated fields of a single crop, they unwittingly created an absolute paradise for one specific local rodent.
The Vesper mouse, scientifically known as Calamus calosus.
The maize provided an unlimited, heavily concentrated food supply. So naturally, the population of the Calamus calosus mouse began to explode.
But nature usually has checks and balances. Predators exist to keep rodent populations from surging out of control.
However, a second, deeply tragic irony occurred simultaneously in these villages.
In an effort to improve public health and fight off the devastating effects of malaria, local authorities had been aggressively spraying the villages with the chemical pesticide DDT.
The goal was to kill the malaria-carrying mosquitoes. And it worked.
But DDT doesn't just vanish after it kills a mosquito. It settles into the dust on the floors, the thatch in the roofs, the surrounding vegetation.
And this is where the bioaccumulation comes in. Cats are meticulous groomers.
Right. As the village cats walked through the homes and the fields hunting for mice, their fur collected the DDT-laden dust.
When they sat down to lick themselves clean, they ingested the pesticide.
The toxin bioaccumulated in their fat tissues until it reached a lethal threshold, essentially poisoning them from the inside out.
Over a very short period, the DDT completely wiped out the feline population of San Joaquín and the surrounding areas.
So you pull the cat block out of the ecological Jenga tower?
The final check on the rodent population is gone. With no natural predators to hunt them and a massive food supply from the maize fields, the Calamus calosus mice multiplied at an astronomical rate.
And as their numbers surged beyond what the fields could support, they began invading the thatch-roofed adobe houses of the villagers looking for shelter and more food.
And here is the fatal biological link. The MARU ecologists, specifically a brilliant scientist named Merle Kuns, engaged in extensive trapping and testing in the region.
And they discovered that the Calamus calosus mouse was the natural reservoir host for the Machupo virus.
Meaning the mouse carries the virus, but it doesn't get sick. It just acts as a living, breeding factory for the pathogen.
Exactly. The mice tolerate the virus perfectly well. But as they lived in the rafters and under the floorboards of the villagers' homes, they were constantly shedding massive amounts of the Machupo virus in their urine and their saliva.
The virus would dry into the dust. When a villager swept the floor, or when a child played in the dirt, or when contaminated food was eaten, the aerosolized virus was inhaled or ingested.
It wasn't human-to-human transmission driving the epidemic. It was the houses themselves that had become deeply toxic.
Once Kuns and the medical team understood this specific mechanism, they realized they didn't need a massive pharmaceutical intervention to break the epidemic.
They didn't need a vaccine. They needed a targeted ecological intervention.
In 1964, they essentially declared war on the mice.
They approached it with rigorous scientific methodology. They didn't just guess that trapping would work. They ran a controlled trial.
They divided the town of San Joaquín in half. Using traps and poison bait, they systematically cleared every single mouse from one half of the town, and they left the other half alone as a control group.
And the results were immediate and undeniable. In the half of the town where the mice were eradicated, the infection rate plummeted instantly.
So armed with that data, they rapidly scaled up the operation. They deployed thousands of traps and cleared the entire town.
And incredibly, after June 28, 1964, not a single new case of black typhus appeared in San Joaquin.
By simply catching mice, they broke a multi-year, highly lethal epidemic in roughly 2 weeks.
It is a profound shift in perspective. The ultimate cure wasn't found in a test tube. It was found by deeply understanding environmental interconnectedness.
But the scientists knew that simply killing the mice currently inside the town was only a temporary fix.
Right. As long as there were still massive maize fields surrounding the village and absolutely no cats to patrol the perimeters, the mouse population would inevitably surge back into the homes the moment the trapping stopped.
Which leads to one of the most surreal and remarkable details of this entire story, provided by the MacKenzie family source.
Yeah. To permanently restore the lost predator balance, to replace the ecological block that the DDT had knocked out, the intervention team coordinated an utterly bizarre logistical maneuver.
They used United States aircraft to literally fly in a plane load of live cats over the Andes and into San Joaquin.
It's a stunning, almost absurd image that perfectly illustrates the lengths they had to go to. They were literally flying in biological pest control to repair the localized ecosystem.
They reintroduced the feline predators, the cats began hunting the mice at the perimeter of the village, and the houses remained safe. The epidemic was permanently broken.
They won. They faced down an invisible terror, they unraveled the ecological mystery, and they saved the town.
But as we transition to the final chapter of this story, we must acknowledge that this victory demanded a staggering, intimately personal toll on the bodies and minds of the people who fought it.
This wasn't a sterile academic exercise. The human cost was immense.
The physical trauma endured by the field medical teams was severe. Dr. Karl Johnson, the man who spent hours with his hands inside that homemade glass box isolating the virus, ended up contracting Bolivian hemorrhagic fever himself in the field.
He suffered the agonizing symptoms and very nearly died before finally recovering.
And Dr. Patricia Webb, despite her intense precautions and expertise, later caught the Machupo virus while working in the MARU laboratory in Panama. Thankfully, she also survived.
But perhaps the most harrowing visceral account of this human cost comes from the family's oral history regarding the evacuation from the jungle.
During the brutal peak of the field operations, Dr. MacKenzie, a Panamanian MARU laboratory technician named Angel Munaz, and a Special Forces medic named Sergeant Lowry all contracted the bleeding fever while working in the Beye.
They were actively dying of the very pathogen they were sent to study. Their vascular systems were beginning to leak.
They were too sick to be treated in the primitive field clinics. They had to be urgently evacuated from the jungle.
They were loaded onto a United States Air Force C-130 cargo plane, a massive, deafening military transport, and flown back to the Canal Zone for desperate, high-level medical care.
And this is where the story finds its most deeply human, emotional anchor. I want you to visualize the tarmac at Howard Field in Panama.
The C-130 touches down. The massive rear cargo doors slowly lower to the runway.
And waiting on the tarmac, in the oppressive heat, is Dr. MacKenzie's wife and his young son. The boy watches as Air Force medics, likely wearing whatever crude, improvised protective gear they could muster, carry his father down the ramp on a military stretcher.
MacKenzie is weak, he is feverish, and he is actively fighting a disease that he knows unequivocally kills 1 out of every 3 people it infects.
And as the medics carry him past his terrified family, he manages to raise a weak hand toward his young son, and he gives a single agonizing command. He says, "Stay away."
Stay away.
It is a devastating moment. It's such a chilling, heartbreaking contrast. You have the deepest, most primal instinct of a father, the fierce, protective instinct to warn his child to stay away from a lethal danger.
And that instinct is completely juxtaposed against the instinct of his chosen profession, which was to run directly, unflinchingly toward that exact same danger in the jungle.
To fully grasp the magnitude of this sacrifice, we'd have to understand that for these officers, contracting a lethal disease wasn't a freak accident.
No, it wasn't a statistical anomaly that caught them by surprise. It was a highly probable, recognized occupational hazard.
They knew exactly what the Machupo virus did to the human body. They performed the autopsies. They knew the 30% fatality rate.
And yet they chose to do the work anyway?
MacKenzie survived the fever. Johnson survived. Munaz and Lowry survived. They paid the physical toll, but they lived to see the end of the epidemic.
But not everyone who walked into the Beye walked out. The man who mobilized the entire U.S. response, the man who sent MacKenzie into the field to get his boots dirty, would not outlive the era.
We need to focus on Dr. Henry Beye, the senior NIH and MARU figure who directed the operations.
Dr. Beye's story is the ultimate embodiment of the ethos of the Public Health Service in that specific historical moment.
Relying on the public record, specifically his obituary published in the New York Times, we know that Dr. Beye died in Panama on April 9, 1964, at the age of 52.
Right as the rodent trapping campaign was proving successful.
And the family accounts add a deeply tragic, incredibly poignant layer to the official obituary. They recount how Dr. Beye stayed in the field, continuing to direct the frantic, exhausting MARU response despite being gravely ill himself.
The family suspects he had contracted a severe field-acquired fungal infection called blastomycosis, which attacks the lungs.
And that he possibly suffered a subsequent heart attack due to the sheer physical strain. He refused to abandon the mission. He literally worked himself to death trying to stop the epidemic.
Think about the immense psychological weight of leadership in that context. Beye represented a generation of public health leaders who believed that the mission was absolute.
The work continues. The epidemic must be broken, even if the body of the leader fails.
He did not ask his people, his young officers like MacKenzie, to take risks in the jungle that he was not willing to bear himself.
And his sacrifice was deeply recognized by the people he helped save. The town of San Joaquín didn't build a cold, static bronze statue in a park to honor him.
No, they built a living monument. They built the Centre de Salud Henry K. Beye.
A fully functioning, first-level public health clinic that continues to provide preventive care, deliver babies, and cure the sick to this very day.
It is a profound, enduring legacy. And it's also worth noting that the nation of Bolivia officially recognized the immense heroism of the MIRU team, later awarding the Order of the Condor of the Andes, their absolute highest civilian honor, to Dr. Karl Johnson and Dr. Ronald MacKenzie.
When you look at young officers like MacKenzie and Johnson, who literally watched their mentor, Dr. Beye, work himself into an early grave for the sake of the mission, you realize how it forged an incredibly intense, unbreakable commitment to the work.
It proved that this wasn't just an academic exercise in a lab coat, it was a visceral matter of life and death.
But as we transition to the conclusion of this deep dive, we have to look at what eventually happened to the institution that made all of this impossible heroism happen in the first place.
We have to talk about the ultimate fate of MRU and, by extension, the broader strategy of the U.S. Public Health Service. Because this incredible zenith of global physical reach did not last.
The historical record shows that severe funding disputes and bureaucratic friction began affecting MRU as early as October of 1963.
Right in the middle of the Bolivian crisis when they were fighting for their lives.
Why dismantle it?
Yeah.
If they just proved the absolute necessity of having a forward-operating citadel in the tropics by stopping a plague, why would Washington start pulling the plug?
It was a shift in philosophy and budgets. As the 1960s turned into the 1970s, the budgets for global public health began to contract significantly.
The priorities shifted inward.
Exactly. The incredibly expensive, logistically heavy model of maintaining overseas research outposts fell out of favor. Administrators argued that with faster jet travel and better freezers, specimens could just be shipped back to the United States.
So MARU and several similar overseas citadels were eventually wound down. They were handed off to local governments, defunded, and ultimately dismantled.
It really is the fall in our story of the rise and fall of the U.S. Public Health Service.
The dismantling of MARU meant that the United States effectively lost that forward-operating physical footprint.
They lost the immediate on-the-ground capability that had allowed a guy like MacKenzie to jump into an AT-6 aircraft, fly under the Andes, and stop a plague in its tracks before it could spread across the continent.
It forces us to look at the story we just explored in a completely different, slightly melancholy light. This was a profoundly serious, deeply human chapter in the history of science.
It's a story defined by incredible, desperate improvisation. We are talking about autopsies performed with carpenter's handsaws while honoring local burial customs with rocks.
We are talking about isolating a lethal virus inside a homemade glass box sealed with rubber gloves.
We are talking about a literal planeload of cats flown over the mountains to repair a broken ecosystem.
And fundamentally, it is a story of immense, unquantifiable personal sacrifice by the scientists who bled for the virus, by the Special Forces soldiers who dropped out of the sky to provide bedside care.
And by the Peace Corps nurses who sat with that dying when there was no cure to offer.
They faced down an unknown terror, operating at the absolute edge of human knowledge, endurance, and geography. And they won.
But the physical infrastructure that supported them, the citadel that launched them into the fight, is gone.
Which brings us back to the image of the fortress. a citadel built to stand in the front lines against microscopic invaders. The men and women of MARU proved that the wall between humanity and a localized apocalypse is often incredibly thin.
It can be as thin as a pane of glass in a Panama laboratory, or as fragile as the predator-prey balance of village cats and mice.
So, I leave you with this final thought to mull over. If an ecological misstep as incredibly simple and well-intentioned as spraying for mosquitoes and accidentally removing the local cats could trigger a horrifying, highly lethal epidemic in 1959.
What unseen, highly complex dominoes might we be unknowingly knocking over in our vastly more interconnected ecosystems today?
And if one of those dominoes falls and a new invisible killer emerges from the shadow of a cleared jungle, do we still have the outposts and the heroes ready to catch it?